Good afternoon and welcome to the final session of today before the collaboration drink session at 5 o'clock, not as I said before 6 o'clock. So we have a session now on, if you will, it might be another form of collaboration, it might be a bit more combative. We were using the term kiss and punch in the last session. Let's see. But this is a conversation about policy and policymakers and the relationship with business. This is a forum now for all of us, and I hope we have an open forum and not just some gentle ping-pong questions and answers, that we have a discussion here about is policy working? Can we plan for the long term? Do we know where we stand? The degree to which policy is important for us, the degree to which we are working, if you will, beyond policy. And we have a panel who hopefully represents a broad spectrum of views here. We have, and if I go from left to right, or is it left to right? Left to right from where you're looking, Sarah Vaughan, who's Director of Strategy and Regulation of E.ON. I think you started with regulation and you were given strategy afterwards, which is a great incentive, I think, for all of us to plan our careers in an effective way. CEO, by the way, does from here on stand for Chief Energy Officer. And you should all aspire. It used to stand for Chief Electricity Officer, if those of you remember the 1920s and 30s. But anyway, it did. So, we're all on the right track. Anyway, Sarah, sorry, you're Director of Strategy and Regulation for E.ON, and we'll give a view from E.ON. Howard Johns may give a different view. I think we spoke a little before the session. He's the founder of Southern Solar, and he's been on most sides of this debate. And I think he feels a bit outside the debate at the moment, but we shall see. We shall see. Rhian Kelly, who I last met on a platform at a leading bank where she was extremely impressive arguing in the financial industry, is here now from the CBI. And the CBI has some views on carbon that you may have heard recently, and we'll see if our views and her views are aligned. She tells me they are. We've misinterpreted the data, but let's see what we hear. And last but not least, we have Peter Boyd, who has two roles, or three even. No, he works with DEC, but he's got the longest title of today, so I'm going to read it to you. He's Expert Chair to the Energy Efficiency Deployment Office. In fact, Edward Davies has been saying some very nice things about him behind his back, which may or may not be to his benefit. We shall see. So that's 4/5 of our panel. We have one more panel member, Michael Liebrich, who is on his way as we speak, hopefully. He had an urgent dental appointment, which sounds like a bad excuse, but it really was. He went to Rio, and I don't know what happened in Rio. I've been to Rio, and things have happened to me. I didn't end up with a broken tooth, but other things. Anyway, that's another story. But anyway, he's on his way, hopefully back, and so he may appear and do a final closing point. But was anybody, while we're just talking about Rio, was anybody here at Rio? We have one member of our panel who was at Rio. Yes, Clay, you were at Rio. Anybody else? Well, we can certainly talk about Rio and the relevance or not of Rio to our conversation, and Howard's going to speak about it. But let us start, and I'm going to just say that after I've asked the panel to say a few words at the beginning, I'm really going to open it up seriously to a conversation. And the question I'm going to ask the panel, I'm going to ask everybody to have a thought about as I ask it. And the question really is the relationship between business and policymakers working, or is it not? Or how could it be better? How is the relationship between business and policy? Somebody asked, is we just talking UK? Well, no, we can be talking UK, we can be talking internationally, globally. We can be talking about Germany, they call it the Energiewandel, apparently, which is German for U-turn, right? Yeah? Anyway. So, without more ado, I mean, Sarah, you've sort of got the short straw here. Would you like to kick off from E.ON and give us your views on policy and business?
I can certainly do that. We started off with this panel being told we had to do 5 minutes introduction, and then we were told no, we didn't, because Howard would come along and he'd do 15 minutes. So Michael would come. Yes, you could do 15 minutes if you want. So we're back on the 5 minute introduction. So somewhat unprepared, but let's go with the flow. Okay, I guess my reflections on this would be that if you find yourself in a situation where the policymakers or the regulators and the industry always agree, and there are never areas of disagreement, so you've reached the point where there is so much collaboration between them, then that's probably going to end up having a bad result. And if you look at Ofgem, for example, in sort of 2007, 2008, Ofgem and the industry were in what I would have called a normal business-as-usual relationship, where they would pull us up on certain things and we would complain about them in certain areas. But as far as the outside world was concerned, Ofgem just wasn't being hard enough on the industry. And so we ended up with them being accused of being in our pockets and being spineless, which then turned into a complete volte-face, where Ofgem then started talking about giving us a good kicking and, knocking us out with a left hook, and then when we're on the floor, taking a right hook at us. So I think that the sort of situation that you can get yourself into where industry and regulator or policymaker seem to agree too much just doesn't work, frankly. But out of disagreements can also come good policy. So if you look at where we were following the 2020 agreement that the EU put together, we went away, we did some modelling on that, and for us, the implications that was going to have for the industry as a whole really could not be underestimated. We saw that as requiring absolutely fundamental change in the market in which we operated. So we went to DEC and we explained our position to DEC, and DEC said, no, you're wrong, the market will deliver. And we said, no, guys, look at the modelling, it makes it quite clear that the market absolutely will not deliver. But over time, we've managed to persuade DEC to a position where they also acknowledged that things needed to change in the market. And so that took us to the position where we are today with electricity market reform. Now, I wouldn't say that we agree with absolutely everything that DEC is putting forward in electricity market reform. But again, that's probably the right answer, because you need to have that tension that comes out of trying to keep the 3 points of the trilemma, security of supply, affordability, and low carbon, all in tension. I think my sort of final reflection would be one that is both for DEC and indeed for us as the industry. And if you'll forgive the pun, it comes out of Spider-Man. I have 2 small children, so I spend a lot of time with Spider-Man. And there is a great phrase in that which says, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think that applies equally in the case of DEC, which has to look at the policy framework that it sets out. It has to realise that industry needs certainty, it needs predictability, and it needs a robust framework. And the sort of U-turns and drastic changes that we have seen in certain areas in the past are not a good thing for industry. But equally for ourselves, as a large industry player, we have to behave responsibly. We have to be conscious of our responsibility to our customers, both big and small. And so when things are happening that are driving prices up, for example, we need to make sure that we take the time to actually explain to customers what is lying behind that, and to seek to do everything we can to help mitigate the impacts of that for our customers.
Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. I hate to think what happens if you do a prepared speech. That was terrific. Thank you. Now, Howard, I know you have some strong views. So, are you going to share them, or are you going to be shy?
No, sure. I'll share my views. It's been a very interesting journey for me. So, 10 years ago, I set up a solar company. I grew it from myself to now about 100 people. For the last 4 years, I chaired the trade association called the Solar Trade Association, and you've probably heard our name in the last 6-9 months because we've been in a pitch battle in the media with the government over its handling of our support mechanism, the feed-in tariff. I found myself going from 9 months ago, a year ago, meetings with the minister in Chatham House discussing the opportunity for solar. So a year ago, solar didn't feature on the renewables roadmap. It still doesn't currently. Hopefully, in its revision this summer, solar will be considered as a strategic renewable technology, which it surely should be, considering the scales on which it's being deployed across the world and now in the UK. So we've had a very patchy history, the solar industry, with the UK government. In my 10 years of running a company, probably in 7 out of the 10 years, we've had some battle around some grant scheme or other. So my first one was probably about 5 or 6 years ago, being on Channel 4 News one night saying, yeah, so the grant scheme opened and it closed in 45 minutes this month. So it's a really good support mechanism for growing solar. And this has been a consistent theme for our industry, which unfortunately came to an almighty crashing end last December, really. Not the end of the industry and not the end of solar in the UK, you understand, but just, solar, basically, we got to this great position where the government launched the feed-in tariff in response to these 2020 EU targets. Ed Miliband's new position, the leader of DEC, within the first 2 weeks they published an energy bill, and to all of our surprise, actually, it had a feed-in tariff in there, thanks to a very active parliamentarian called Alan Simpson, who'd been around and lobbied it into existence, basically. And then, 2 months before it was due to launch, we still didn't have any detail, for example. Fortunately, it did launch March 2 years ago, and the industry took off at a pace, basically. It was a very exciting time for everyone in the sector, and we went from 400 companies in the course of a year to 4,500 companies. So an amazing, one of the few sectors in a recession that was growing dramatically, and very exciting times for lots of people. So a year ago, I was sat in a round table with the minister, advising them that actually solar is going to be huge, and the feed-in tariff is wrong at the moment. The rates are too high, and they must bring them down as soon as possible. We wrote a whole paper around deployment in the UK, and unfortunately they listened, and for the first time we had a headline in The Guardian saying, Minister rethinks solar. They actually think this is a good idea now, which was a huge step forward for us. But unfortunately they didn't take our advice seriously, and they didn't touch the rate. So then, come the autumn, the industry had stormed on, and at that point we had rumour that actually the feed-in tariff was so successful that they'd spent the entire budget allocated for it in the spending review, and they were going to have to shut the scheme, basically. So hence we went into an almighty PR campaign to put them on the spot and say, well, hang on a minute, there's 4,500 companies now, there's about 30,000 workers, and we're making you in excess of £100 million worth of tax income this year. You can't just dismiss us like that. So it wasn't pleasant. It was particularly difficult because when they announced the changes, they said, we're going to make these changes in 6 weeks' time, but we're going to be consulting on them for 8 weeks. And, the rules around this stuff say they have to consult for a certain period, it has to lay in front of Parliament for 40 days of Parliament time, and then they can make the changes. And they chose at that point to disregard that. So a few companies and various Friends of the Earth got together and actually took the government to court. It went to three High Court hearings, and we won, basically, every one of them, saying that the executive were acting unlawfully or attempting to act unlawfully. And, those companies were much criticised by government and by those in the sector, actually. But I think, for all in the room, anyone who's trying to do something in this space, we really do need to hold the executive to account if they're going to change the rules illegally. We can't have that happening because it makes the whole market completely unstable.
All right, well, let's leave that as the hanging question. It's more difficult being on the left-hand end of this panel than the right-hand end of this panel, I think. But we'll give you some support. And Rian, you're kind of there from the CBI, could you give us? I know you've been a little bit misunderstood, and so you want to plead your case. No?
Well,
We can deal with that in a minute, but I guess just
All
to follow on the theme of is it working? Are we working in the right way with government? How is it? I was going to make 3 points. The first of which is I think, particularly on green issues, climate change and energy, I think there already has been a strategic change in the way in which government and business are working together. I think particularly climate change is an area where businesses recognise there's been a market failure. And if there's been a market failure, then they'll be calling for government action to help address that failure. And for many businesses, it's both a failure in terms of managing the risks, but for a lot of businesses, it's a failure in terms of there's a lot of opportunity out there, so how do we make the most of that opportunity? The low-carbon environmental goods and services sector is worth something like £112 billion to the UK and about 8% of our GDP. Many businesses are saying, well, how do we create with government a framework then that allows us to take advantage of that? So I think... when I came into this in about 2007, and at that point in time it wasn't clear there was a lot of business support for the low-carbon agenda for climate change. And I think since 2007 we've seen quite a significant change in the way in which businesses are addressing, thinking about green, thinking about energy efficiency, thinking about targets. The CBI as an organisation signs up to the 2050 target, signs up to the fourth carbon budget, and is indeed doing and producing evidence to suggest that green is a significant part of growth in the economy. It's not a choice. You can't do green or growth. You do green and growth. And I think what that then leads into is a place where the business community is actively working with government to put in place regulation, legislation and policy. And when I look across the work that's done at the CBI, that is not always the case in the other areas that we might be dealing with. In many instances, businesses are trying to reduce the amount of regulation, are trying to reduce the burden of policy on their businesses. Whereas I think, broadly speaking, in the climate change space, we are looking for the right regulation to drive the right behaviour. And I think that's quite an interesting sort of observation I have been able to make. So we, with the likes of Sarah and other companies, have been calling for electricity market reform since 2009. We've been calling for mandatory carbon reporting. In fact, we did the initial piece of work to design and influence the way in which DEFRA's voluntary guidelines have come out, and that is what probably will be the basis for mandatory reporting. And we are calling for, businesses are telling us, we need further regulation to underpin things like the Green Deal. Worth mentioning that also because that is not the case in other countries. When I go abroad to the US business community, the CBI equivalent in the US, absolutely trying to make sure that there is no climate change legislation, that there are no targets. If I go to Japan, exactly the same in Japan. The Japanese business community thinks they're doing enough voluntarily, and there's absolutely no reason that the Japanese government should set any more severe targets. It is a little bit more nuanced in Europe, but certainly the conversations I have with our Italian counterparts, our Austrian counterparts, they too are trying to do as much as they can to slow the agenda down. So I think we shouldn't entirely beat ourselves up in the UK, because as a business community, I think we are already in the lead in the way in which we work with government. But, and there is always a but, we're in difficult times. It's very challenging economically, but there's a lot of big policy pieces that are needing to put in place. And when you start to put big chunky bits of policy in place, inevitably it throws up a number of challenges, confidence being one of them. Consumers and businesses are hearing mixed messages from government. The U-turns on solar, but on other bits of legislation, mean that businesses don't know what to do, and that trickles down into consumers. Households also, I think, don't know what the right decision is. They don't know what to do. They're hearing different things from government, and different policies are telling them different things. There's a complexity of policy out there, so businesses are finding and I've heard this from CEOs, they have lots of different acronyms. They all begin with C. They sometimes have another C in them. Frankly, I don't know how they all add up. So it's a really quite tricky landscape to negotiate. And competitiveness for some industries and some businesses, this is costing them, and we don't want to be pushing our energy-intensive industries, particularly offshore. We want to make here the steel that will build wind turbines. We want the chemicals made here that will lubricate the wind turbines. So we need to make sure that we do all this in a way that manages complexity, increases confidence, and increases competitiveness. So there is, therefore, I think, a really strong role for the organisations like the CBI to be a critical friend to government, yet to support the strategic aims and the ambitions, and to encourage government to stick to that, but also to make sure that we, as Sarah said, sort of we create that tension. We're there to sort of help design policy that actually works for the market, that works for businesses. And my final comment then, my third point would be, we're getting to a stage with some of these policies where we're translating ideas into pretty complicated things that need to deliver on the ground. And that's about commercialising policy. It's about understanding the way markets work. It's about understanding the way individual businesses work. It's about understanding the way in which decisions inside businesses are made. And I don't think that's always the expertise of governments. They sit and make policy. So when we're trying to get to a place where we're actually commercialising this, people are actually taking decisions on the back of it, then I think there is a role for businesses to work much more closely with government. There are things government can do. They could be clear about the projects they're working on. They could have one account manager for a project across government. They could have somebody held responsible so that if you're an investor, if you're a firm, if you're looking to do something, you know exactly who you go and talk to, you know exactly who's accountable. But also, I think they need the expertise that exists in the business community, particularly in the financial community. And I think we need to be thinking much more deeply about how we provide that. One idea we've had is around secondees into the private sector. But we need people inside government who speak the language of business, who are able to make those decisions and have a better chance of translating the policy ideas into reality on the ground.
Thank you very much, Rian. Thanks. Well, Peter, you've got 1 day a week to fix all this. But you've just been in Rio as well, which is interesting. So maybe you'd like to give a bit of a perspective from actually having just recently changed role and seen it also internationally. Yeah?
Sure. Excellent. Thanks. And good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, before we start, I actually feel more affinity with the panel than you might expect. One, because I think 15 years in the private sector, 3 years in an NGO, which is my day job most of the time, called the Carbon War Room, which is effectively looking at the left side of the cost curve, solutions to climate change on a global basis that make money right now on current policy and current technology, and then, as you said, 1 day a week and 3 weeks into the job in the deck row. So in terms of what we've heard before, I like to really just say the critical friend to government was effectively part of my remit. So in terms of coming in with the private sector view and then saying, well, what can work and how do we commercialize policy is hopefully what I'm hoping to help, as you say, 1 day a week. But with that, I'd like to sort of take a bit of time internationalizing it first with that sort of my day job hat on. Are we getting there on the status quo, and what relevance, if any, does Rio have? Two big numbers, and I know Jonathan Porritt was here earlier, and if he landed these points already, then it's good to re-land them. But there's two numbers here in terms of scale. This 768 is the number of grams of CO2 it takes to generate $1 of GDP in the world today. That's just two big numbers, one divided by the other. If the basic trends are going to continue as we expect them to be, 9 billion people by 2050, income trends in the developing world, consumption in the Western world, etc., energy needs going up as they are, the actual number we need to get to is 6. So this is 768 grams to 6. This isn't it lovely, me as a company have saved 10% of my water needs on 5 years ago. This is a 99% pivot in the economy in terms of carbon intensity. So in terms of the very short answer of is the status quo working, the answer is blatantly not. If you then put that on to Rio as a task, I think I came back as a sort of saying it was a good week for Carbon War Room and a terrible week for the planet. It really was, I don't know, people there, I sort of filled with hope and despair. And being an ex-consultant, I have a classic 2x2 for anyone afterwards if you want to share it. But really the sort of, the hope and despair cuts across words and people. The despair on words, if anyone here has read the text, then that is 2 hours of your life you'll never get back. It is the most disgusting lowest common denominator that sort of your most junior people in your companies could have written. If anything sort of was at all good, it would be we note, we reaffirm, we recognize, rather than we commit, we decide, we act. I don't think the we act actually was actually one word mentioned, whereas lots of notes and recognized. So massive amounts of despair there, and if you haven't read it, don't bother. In terms of the hope, though, on words, there was some really good stuff there, and I'm thinking that the couple of corporates in the audience that were there were part of that story. Over 700 commitments, voluntary, were logged. It looked like a sideshow, or the governments thought it was a sideshow, and in the end, that was the story coming out of Rio. There's 700 commitments, $500 billion worth of commitments saying the green economy is over this way and we're doing it anyway. And then there was other good announcements like the GO7, of which the UK is part of, 0.7% of GDP committed to overseas development, etc., etc. So hope and despair on words. I suppose that the other thing is on people. I think there's a tremendous amount of despair, and this is, again, my personal / Carbon War Room hat on rather than anything official. But despair in terms of the culture of professional negotiators stepping into UNFCCC, stepping into Rio, or what conference is it this week? Which country do I try and bash, and where do I roadblock everything? These professional negotiators are basically preventing anything from really happening at that multilateral basis. So, to answer your question, status quo and multilateral government on this green agenda, I have a very low point of view. I think we even had the words negotiator kicking around the halls, and Rio +20, -40 as well. But I think to finish on my top right is saying the hope is really on the people. There was 50,000 people there, governments, NGOs, businesses, all actually in the side halls doing deals, doing businesses, launching the green economy and heading off in the right direction, which we all know is going to happen anyway. So that's a sort of 2 minutes thumbnail on Rio. In terms of the actual sort of question, in terms of well, what are we doing and how can the government play a key role? Again, incoming, as I say, I share more with Howard and a nervousness that says how long is my tenure going to last, as opposed to sort of leap to the government's defence. I just hope we can do something together and commercialise the policy that is most needed. I think the key piece, I think, in terms of general terms, government is a key role in TLC, transparency, longevity, consistency. Obviously, that hasn't happened per the examples here, but that doesn't mean to say it can't happen going on, especially on energy efficiency, because it's the left side of the cost curve. This on the whole makes money already. It on the whole creates jobs already, and it reduces CO2. How can we get it done together? And I'd just like to pick up on another point of agreement here, is this, like, climate change is an area where business and government do realize that a key few pieces of rules here, fundamentally pricing externalities, the tragedy of the commons. Good companies are getting outbid by bad companies, and they don't like it. So increasing information, increasing a level playing field is a great place for governments to play together with business when we're trying to solve climate change together. I just think, just to finish really on the opening remarks, sort of post-Copenhagen, post-Rio, this sort of role for business and policy, it really is the massive 2 words is step up. Because sort of governments aren't going to do this on their own. They can't. It's frankly too complicated. It's too big a task. And also, where is this capital going to come from anyway? There's 300 billion philanthropic capital in the world. There's 18,000 billion government money in the world. And there's 125 trillion of private capital. So if we need $1 trillion to move into the green economy, where is that slice of the pie going to come from? It's private capital serving customers and making business. So it really is a business must step up, I think. And then the last point really is just sort of the world will only really notice when white vans pull up at buildings. Likewise, the green economy only works when a white van pulls up at a building because it's paid by somebody. And it doesn't care about announcements, it doesn't care about commissions, and it doesn't care about policy. So we've got to turn these things into action if we're actually going to do anything about this.
Thank you, Howard. Fantastic. So thank you to the panel for that. Now it's our turn. There's a gentleman in the front row I know who may have a point we wish to make in a moment. Yeah, please.
Sure. I didn't expect to be first cab off the rank, but anyway. I also read the Rio Declaration. I let Microsoft Word read it for me. I looked for the references to energy efficiency. I found 3. 1 was noting and 2 were references. I was underwhelmed. Yeah. Look, I think this is really interesting, and Howard, I feel for you. I've seen things like this happen in industry, and I've been in a policy role when something like this happened to me, and I had lighting manufacturers saying, look, we're laying off people next week. And I was part of the process that had to mop that up. It's tough on policy people as well as industry. But what I think is going on in the UK that I do take heart in is I do think you have a learning approach happening. You have some durability. The commitments are clear. It's about climate change. You've got to address that. It's about where is your future energy supply is going to come from. You've got to address that. And you've got to fundamentally rethink your housing stock, your building stock, your industry, etc., etc., etc. There is some good, durable foundations happening here, even despite changes of government. So having said all that, I still think there's a lot of problems in the details of making good policy here. And I still think the best policies I've seen made have been ones where governments actually sat down with industry and said, look, we actually need to understand, get beyond lobbying and actually understand, we need data from you about, how your market's working, how we achieve our overall policy objectives by enabling you to do what you can do. Peter talked about the scale of capital required. I mean, the IEA's energy technology ETP came out 2 weeks ago. We're talking $36 trillion investment for $100 trillion payback in energy savings. That's that scale of money that we need to do this. And it's not going to happen by the private sector doing it alone. There's no way governments can fund this scale of activity. China's starting to do it.
Okay.
I think the UK is close behind. But, this takes a joint public-private approach. It's the only way we're going to get there.
How many? Just do a show of hands here. I mean, we've got the sort of the collaboration approach, which is being expressed here, where we sit down, we have some common goals, objectives. We come from different places, but we work together rather than sit outside. What's that expression about outside the tent? Whatever, the one inside the tent. So let's have a show of hands. How many think actually it needs to be collaborative and we do need to sit together? Show of hands. Right, and it looks to me like quite a lot of hands up. Is anybody going to put a hand up and say, actually, policy, it's really not very relevant to us anymore. We're just going to get on with it. They keep changing their minds. Stuff it. It's just not worth my time. Anybody want to put their hand up for that? Well, there we are. That's what? Jim, did you put your hand up? Did you? All right. Well, let's hear your view then.
I sort of read an FT article with Jochen Zeitz after Rio, and he said that there were sort of three groups. There was the policy advocates who left Rio extremely disappointed. There were the NGOs who also left Rio very disappointed. But then there were the business people who had a fantastic time because they all networked, they shared a lot of innovation. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of, a growing number of CEOs, and we saw it earlier with Steph from Desso, who are just kind of going beyond the policy framework. And actually, Steph scarcely mentioned policy in his talk next door. I think we are seeing a growing number of companies who are almost leaving the policy agenda behind. It's obviously hard for utility companies, but for others, I think we are seeing that.
Thank you. All right. By the way, the gentleman who just came in is Michael Liebrich, fresh from the dentist, and who may be able to speak with one half of his mouth to us in a moment. But let me just see, are there any other burning? I haven't really given everybody a chance to put their hand up. Has anybody got a burning thing they'd like to say? We've had a very stimulating session with the panel. Who'd like to? Yes, over here. Somebody got a microphone? Thank you, Charlotte.
Sure. My name's Richard Pammenter. I'm Head of Sustainability for GSK. When we look at policy, all policy I see is gauged around either energy supply or energy efficiency. Yet if you actually look at the carbon problem, it's a value chain problem. And I see no policy that incentivises driving reduction across the value chain. So to give you a simple example, not in my industry, there's no incentive. So I'll give you an example in my industry. There's no incentive for us to use a much lower carbon impact chemical to make a drug, because there's no tax break for the maker of that if it's just an embedded carbon. there is an incentive for us to use less energy in our own operation. But if you looked at the footprint of the planet, it's a far better value for money to go for a lower carbon impact raw material. And I just wonder what the panel's view is on, are we too skewed to thinking about energy on its own and not putting policy around the overall low carbon value chain?
Okay, Ryan?
Well, I'll jump in and say two things. I think that there is absolutely more room for policy to take into account the opportunities down value in supply chains. There are already schemes out there in places like Japan where, as a major company or corporate, you're able to get some credit in some format for the actions you might be supporting down your supply chain. We absolutely ought to be thinking exactly the same way in the UK. But secondly, I think this is a broader discussion about value chains in the UK and working out. It sort of comes back to industrial policy, and I think we ought to be thinking more seriously about industrial policy in the round in the UK, but absolutely the bit around green and green business, because there are bits of value chains in the UK we have a huge opportunity, and we could be exporting those opportunities. There's a real risk if we don't nurture them. Frankly, we're just going to be looking behind because everybody will have done it before us.
Thank you. Yes.
Sort of jump in just to add, it's not just only an energy policy, it's an electricity policy. Because let's face it, our renewable energy targets are around renewable heat. And yes, we've got a renewable heat incentive now, but that's the first time ever that this government, or any government really, has addressed renewable heat. So it's not just energy per se, it's even narrower focus than that. I think it's just the history of the department that are writing the policy. They've come from running the electricity system traditionally. So it's legacy.
Did you want to say something, Sarah?
Well, I mean, I guess all that I would say, and it is as an energy company, is I think that government, partly because it's DEC, and DEC will focus on that, but they focus on the energy industry because that is a way in which they can make really large strides quite quickly. So if you look at the 80% target, greenhouse gas reduction target by 2050, decarbonising the generation sector, you are not going to be able to do it without decarbonising the generation sector. And so I think you start probably with the big stuff, and you start by looking at those sorts of things and the levers that you can pull at that level. And then potentially, as Rian says, you move on to looking at other incentives you can bring in. I guess the risk is that you end up with so many interventions and so many policy levers being pulled that people really don't know, end up knowing quite where they are.
All right, thank you. Well, we've maybe got time for one more question. Before then, I'll ask Michael to say a few words. Yes, over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name's Tristan Mackey from Green Peninsula. The topic was about policy or business and who should be leading the change. I think it's also about educating ordinary people. If we don't bring them with us, we're either pushing them in front or dragging them behind us. And so therefore it's about behavioural change. I think it was Ronan Dunn a couple of weeks ago talk about behaviour change. That's how O2 are doing it. So it's just behaviour change for policy writers and business leaders and helping to take ordinary people with them. Just panel's views on that, please.
Okay. Well, does anybody want to guess, Sarah?
Well, agree fundamentally. Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. We're never going to go anywhere on this, particularly when you're looking at the things like the Green Deal, the energy company obligation, unless we can get people to make that sort of sea change in attitude, to change it so that people really are worrying, wondering about how they can save more energy in their homes, then we are really, really not going to get anywhere near where we need to get to.
Yes, right.
A few years ago we did some research, and it will roughly stand today, but that consumers in the UK control or influence about 60% of greenhouse gas emissions. So actually they're hugely influential in exactly what they do in their homes in terms of heating and lighting, and also in the things that they buy in their shopping baskets. They will drive competition, we think, in the business community to make more energy efficient products, but also they create the political space where it makes some of the difficult decisions possible.
very good. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, it's okay to come back on just a couple of points because I think there's some really valid ones that we've come across there. I mean, one quick one is on the sort of the UK versus international. Again, most of my experience on this has been outside the UK until recently, and I think it's a bit like the NHS. You have to go outside the UK to fall in love with how good it is on an international basis. Sort of our discussion here in the UK is at least rational. At least both sides of the political parties can mention the word climate change. And there are some countries in this world where you're unelectable. And there's a thing called brownwashing, where you actually put under the carpet previously good environmental decisions you made, which would now render you unelectable if people heard about them. At least the UK has got a rational debate. I think so. That's one. I think the other thing is the policy, as I've seen it, and we've got to ramp up to launch and beyond, especially on energy efficiency. It's one of the best models that sort of we've seen with my NGO hats on, looking around the world. There's not many that have designed an idea to get round the split incentive problem and actually looking at getting private capital moving and engaging the big six utilities in order to be part of that plan. So there's not many examples out there in the world yet. And the reason, we're all sort of worrying about it and debating about it is because it's hard. It hasn't been solved in 30 years, and it's supposed to have made money 30 years ago. So no wonder it's hard and we're having the debates.
Right. Okay, well, I think we've given Michael a bit of time. I think we've given Michael a bit of time to hear a few of the things that are floating around. But I think it's a little hard on him coming straight from the dentist chair. But he has come from Rio before that. Michael is by the way, head of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And he's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Sustainable Energy. He's one of only 3 people in the room we've discovered, Michael, who was in Rio. Clay over here was in Rio. I don't know if you had a drink in the bar. And of course, Peter was in Rio as well. But Michael, if you'd like to just give us a few thoughts, and then we'll move to a close of the conference. From your chair?
Yeah.
Or here?
No, I'll speak from my chair, and I apologise for lateness. I cracked a tooth in Rio, so Rio was a horrible failure. But I'll also now try and do something that's not only impossible but also very difficult, which is to summarise a discussion that I haven't heard. But this question of who should lead is and I've sort of walked in and it's a domestic discussion here, but Peter, you just brought it back to an international level, and it's very much the theme or the takeaway for me from Rio was not the specifics of the outcome document, nor of many of the individual initiatives, because in 2 years' time there would be a different initiative, whether it's oceans, whether it's energy, whether it's transport or cities or whatever. But it's just this kind of a wrestling match between who's going to lead, or if that's the glass half full version. Glass half empty is who's going to resist and go as slow as possible. Because what you saw in Rio, I think, was 3 Rios. I don't know which ones you were at, but I was in the kind of side eventocracy Rio. The other 2 being the advocacy Rio and the negotiation Rio. And what I think we've seen is that the bits that I saw and I was involved in were actually very successful. There's something like $500 billion was committed in Rio to real platforms for change that were sometimes business-led, with the public sector then, the policymakers coming in to enable, and sometimes they were policy-led, with business then coming in, which I would say is sort of the Sustainable Energy for All one that I was involved in, and sometimes they were multilateral bank-led, $175 billion program launched by the multilateral banks for public transport. So that was kind of not really private sector, not really public sector, but something in between. But these are large amounts of money now, totaling $500 billion. The Sustainable Energy for All was about $1/3 trillion, which was, a lot of it was Brazil reaffirming and essentially tripling its clean energy program. But there was also Bank of America. The second biggest commitment was Bank of America. I don't know what the third biggest, but there was Siemens, there was Statoil. Statoil made some incredibly strong out there statements about their desire to see fossil fuel subsidies eliminated and a price on carbon, and this is an oil company. So there are examples. It's just I don't think there's a single answer, therefore, in terms of who should lead, but there's definitely a change of era from 20 years ago, it was absolutely clear that the dynamic was activists pressurized, and then governments, and in a sense it was just the big governments, the developed world, because they were either doing things or paying for things. So if they went to the first Rio and decided they were going to take action, which broadly they did, then something came out of it. So whereas here, on that level, it's a very different era, because now it's truly a multipolar world. A lot of the developing world is still trying to squeeze money out of the developed world. They obviously simply don't read the news. And so that model was not working in the negotiations and not working for the activists. The activists with all their little posters and doing their empowerment and engagement of youth and bringing kids along to talk. I mean, it's all great stuff, but it's just a 20th century tactic in a 21st century world. So I think that we can sort of forget those two extremes and concentrate on the bit which is, I don't like the words public-private partnership, because they tend to be sort of weasel words that enable people to escape responsibility for taking action. But it really is in that very business-like, on-the-ground area that we saw progress in Rio. And I think that, even from the comments I've heard, that was sort of broadly the theme when you come to the UK. What I would say, though, is that that's the good news. The bad news is that nobody really knows how to do it, because a third of $1 trillion of energy, or $500 billion of overall public transport, ocean protection, etc., sounds like a lot. But once you spread it over 10 years and it's 50 billion a year, that's a tenth or less than a tenth of the market cap of Apple. And so it's obviously trivial. And there's a lot more if you add stuff that wasn't included in commitments at Rio. The amounts we've tracked, 280 billion last year of clean energy spending. If you add some of the other sectors and energy efficiency stuff that we don't notice, it's clearly bigger, but it's not $1.5 trillion or 2 trillion or whatever the number really needs to be. So there's a long way to go. And all of these dimensions, it's not just should it be in the value chain? Of course it should be in the value chain. Should it be more renewable energy? Sure. Should it be more energy efficiency? Sure. Should it be smart grid? Sure. It's got to be essentially on so many different dimensions, and it's also got to be on so many different time scales. A lot of the stuff in the political sphere gets quite short-term, and the politicians like to take shortcuts and have things that they can announce and get column inches. And there's only 2 countries in the world where there's legislation domestic legislation about the very long term, and that is the UK, Mexico, and then one state, which is California, where you've got people working, the politicians and the policymakers working really truly at the both ends of the scale. Europe, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we would have added Europe to that list with the ETS and the long-term caps. But now this absurd discussion about whether there should be a set-aside or not, which is such a marginal discussion compared to the overall health of the ETS and Europe's strategy, I would now almost take Europe off the list. I think you'd probably add Germany and Denmark in practice, but not in legislation. So there's that time frame, and a lot of the stuff that gets, even where there's leadership from the public sector side of things, it's actually it's short-term, it's not particularly effective. So I think some of the more effective initiatives are the ones where business either unilaterally goes ahead and does it, which it can do more and more often now that these technologies are simply competitive, or where it does it working closely with government. And then finally on the UK, the danger is that the alternative to all of that, which is very hard work, is to revert to type and go back to very sort of partisan where people just sort of revert to defending incumbency positions. So fighting, simply saying, well, all of that is nonsense and all we need is nuclear. And then on the other side, all we need is solar and we need the tariffs yay high because otherwise somebody will go bankrupt, which will never be allowed to happen. And this, there is a risk even here that because the public-private policy, sometimes business-led, is actually difficult and longer term, that you the short-term incentives is to do some frankly, quite daft
It's
things.
interesting, Michael, in the sessions we've had before you came in, I think several of us were surprised how long-term the plans were that many of the businesses who presented, to really, and actually looking for policymakers to be as long-term as they were.
Yes, and the best businesses working in this space are ones that have got long-term commitments because they've got leaders who are actually prepared to cathedral build. Jim Rogers of Duke or Pullman at Unilever and so on. Yeah. And these are people who are prepared to do things that are for the long-term preservation or building of the business. But yes, it is.
But maybe China's doing that though as well.
Well, actually, it's very interesting about energy, about needing industrial policy and energy policy, because I would say that in many cases, if I hear those words, I sort of want to reach for my Luger. But I think that you do need, where you have research that's required, that's beyond the time frame of even the most visionary companies, there's a market failure, and also where there are assets that have lives beyond the patience of the capital markets, then clearly is a need for policy intervention. So yes, long-term thinking, how you go about doing it, how you go about encouraging more long-term thinking is a real challenge.
Well, I think that's a good place to bring it together. And thank you very much, Michael, for coming in so spontaneously and giving such a great speech. And thank you to all the panel as well, Pemi, for the fine. I think in today's business world, it's all about being fast on your feet, and that's what everybody has done. So we have to think long term, and we have to be there all the time. So Jim Woods is the head of content of Green Monday. Is going to just give us a final summary before we get to the bar. And will the panel be around to dialogue? Because I know there will be a lot of questions that we didn't get to. But if you buy them a drink, are they free, the drinks? Okay, so you get a free drink and a free question. What could be better? What's not to like? So, Jim, if you'd just like to close the meeting, thank you.
It might be a free drink, but you might have to pay for the answer. I'm not sure. Well, it's been packed today, and I think it's testament to the day that so many of you are here, because quite often at the end of an event, one looks out and it's sparse, but it's great, it's packed. I think trying to draw out of all that we've heard today is very difficult, but what's very clear to me is there are some, what Michael called cathedral builders, companies who are really just doing extraordinary stuff, and we've seen a lot of those today. We've seen M&S finding 23% energy savings in 4 years. We've seen Unilever's 24% energy savings. We've seen Desso's 43% energy savings, all within about 4-year time periods. We saw from IKEA this morning how they are making sustainability look very easy. They're going to have 70% of their energy coming from renewable sources by 2015. Desso, the CEO of Desso, told us that they will get 100% of their energy from renewable sources by 2020. So that we're in this sort of world where there are leaders, engaged CEOs who are just going out in the lead. But I think what we've also heard is, and I think it was a good question earlier about the general public, and I think the general public is the challenge here, either as in his voting capacity or as in his consuming capacity. Because if you want to get your CEO behind your energy strategy, you need to be able to link it to your consumption and your demand, and that's, I think, where a lot of companies are now starting to look. So you've got O2, M&S, SC Johnson, looking at how they can actually engage consumers in this debate, and I think that's for the next sort of 6 months we'll see a lot more progress in that area. So anyway, I'm just going to go on to thank yous now. Thank you to our sponsors and our partners, to E.ON, to Johnson Controls, to GSH, to Utilix. Without those guys, today would not be possible. You have feedback forms. If you wouldn't mind giving us a bit of feedback, we'd love it. Our next Green Monday is this coming Monday. We're starting to look at reframing sustainability as abundance. So looking at the innovations that are out there, how can we harness that to scale? It's a very exciting argument and one that's not always comfortable with people. Thanks to our Little Green Monday team, we've worked really hard for this. Thank you particularly to Georgie, who will be leaving us soon, but has worked tirelessly to get today ready. And really, my final thank you is to you, to the audience. You've been great. You've shared lots of thoughts. It's been a great pleasure for all of us to be here with you. So let's go and have a drink. Thank you very much.